The man who is known as the founder of Indian IT sector, Narayana Murthy, who defined India's IT growth story, has been in the news recently for all the reasons around what he said and what he did not say. He suggested that one should be working 70 hours in a week. Now, millennials and Gen Zs who are already battling long working hours were aghast with the proposal. Setting aside the idea of work-life balance, India's most revered corporate leader, Murthy, said that he used to work nearly 90 hours a week. Murthy also said that he would be in office at 6:20 in the morning, leave office at about 8:30 p.m., worked 6 days a week while he was setting up his company, and that has not been a waste. Clearly, it has not been a waste. It has made Mr. Murthy who he is. But is 90 hours work week advisable? Is it doable? We're discussing that in this very special edition of Business Plus. I want to begin by asking you, is it advisable at all, working 70 to 90 hours work?
Medically, probably no. But the reality is, to be fair to Mr. Narayana Murthy, yes, you need to work harder and longer. We have examples of Korea, China, Taiwan, all their success and turnaround stories have been with long, hard hours. But again, to be fair to Mr. Narayana Murthy's critics, I mean, he grew up in a time, he built his business when there were no emails, there were no mobile phones. He had to do everything in those fixed designated landlines, everything in the office.
In that area?
In that area, in that office. Today, you can be sitting at anywhere and working from anywhere, which is why knowledge workers, especially consulting firms, IT firms, have to reassess their HR policies. What am I expecting from my people? Do I need them to come into the factory-like setup where I count and measure hours? Or can they be sitting wherever as long as privacy and confidentiality aspects are taken care? And can they still deliver the same output? I think that's where we're losing the battle of, is it 40 hours? We can't go the European way of saying that let's work 4-day week. We don't have probably jobs for even billion people. That's a reality. We have to struggle there.
Absolutely.
What do we do that?
Absolutely. I mean, times are changing, Krishna. I mean, it's a very valid point. When people can work from anywhere, they can put in those number of hours, or at least they can deliver on what is expected out of them. Those archaic ideas of working from a place, working for 12 hours, working for 70-hour work a week, is that even doable in today's time and day?
Right. I want to play devil's advocate to both sides of the argument. One is that I from the beginning, I thought it was the arguments were going in the wrong direction, because I thought the intent of Mr. Narayana Murthy was to talk about productivity. We're talking about that this generation and the next generation that's documenting the nothings that they do. That's what this generation is defined as. So, from that perspective, if you were to see, all he's asking is that you want this country to be better, you better be willing to put in the work for it. It's as simple as that, and put in not just hours of work, but in terms of like productivity. But his idea of I think it came out all wrong when he said about 70 to 80 hours a week, and then eventually when he talked about 90 hours a week, these numbers I think take the focus away from what I think he was originally trying to convey, and that is productivity. This generation of workforce from millennials onwards, if you were to ask, who've been hooked on WhatsApp and social media, and how they can even put 9 hour work of work in a day, the final output or outcome ain't all that great. So there are questions on productivity. So and also the kind of environment we work in India, the number of festivals that we have, the number of work days that actually happen in a year. So there are a lot of questions around India's productivity per se. What say, Srinath? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm in the wrong discussion or reading all the headlines wrong. I really thought this was about improving India's productivity.
See, I mean, he did his full speech the first time he gave on that blog podcast was about productivity. But again,
the second time around, not so
was
much.
not about it. And I think it also shows that some of our leaders like him and others have to figure out what do the young Indians
really want.
Absolutely. And how do you communicate to them? The erstwhile style of being preachy, it actually comes across as let's say, almost an arrogant speech of a billionaire, which probably is not the intent, and that's never been his personality or style.
And that makes me do the other end of the spectrum of what we're discussing. Is it a classic case of boomers versus zoomers? Because let's face it, I mean, Mr. Narayana Murthy classically falls under the boomer category, although it's not exactly the most kindest of terms used for people in that age group. But the fact of the matter is that to use it for the sake of an argument, you're talking about the 3 generations in between.
So I probably would use 2 different distinct words for it. What I call as, one definitely is a silver generation, so silver. And the other one that India today, 80% of India falls under gems, gig economy, millennials and Generation Z. So if we think gems is about India's gems, we better treat them right, right? But the silvers also have to get it right. I mean, you can't sound preachy. And young India has proven time and again. And let's go back 30 years. They were also young. The silvers were young, and they built phenomenal enterprises of value and stature. But today's India is very, very different. The way they consume content, the way they consume information, even advice, the way they consume advice is very, very different. So you can't expect them to almost sit with you like a Gurukul style and say, okay, because I'm the boss, I'm telling you, listen to me.
Absolutely.
I think that terms of engagement have gone. But unfortunately, the corporate India still functions with hierarchical terms of engagement, saying, I want to count the number of heads on this floor because I feel comfortable with that practice. What is the output? What is the impact? How do I influence each of them? And which is why you look at every sector, banking, consulting, everything, the knowledge sector, not just the IT or IT years, they still have very high attrition.
Absolutely.
Somewhere we are not able to understand our youngsters of making them stay with you, which means that are they going for more pay? It's not necessarily true. They're going for probably more learning. They're going for more adventures. When I say adventures, it's not just going to Goa or backpacking. It's also to say, let me do my own startup. Let me do something different. I think that's where, how do we bring all this to conversation? So I thought the boomers getting boomeranged is the problem here.
There are two sets of arguments that I want to delve deeper on. First is the legality of working around 70, 80, 90 hours a week. It's not legal. So a company literally cannot expect an employee to work beyond 40 to 50 hours, 40 hours being the legal standard. Another is the productivity argument that Krishna delved into. So the understanding legally is that these are the fixed number of hours that you can expect somebody to work for you, but how do you make them more productive? You can't hold them back in a office setup and expect work to be delivered. So the arguments around 3 days work week, 4 days work week, 6 days work week, where do we arrive at sort of a median between all of this? I think the idea has to be about getting things done, not about holding employees back. At least that is what Gen Zs would want.
So I think we are looking for the word called dignity. I think how do we bring dignity back to everything? I mean, look at, let's say, entry-level IT job. I mean, it's almost like a menial job today, if I can use the word harsh term, but cyber coolie. I mean, it's no different from that. And you're still not employable anywhere else until you're trained or retrained, you're more productive. So how do we bring dignity to such a role? Why do you expect them? They're no better than a factory worker. Sometimes the factory worker earns more than what they earn, considering what they've paid and spent 4 years or 5 years in engineering college. I think dignity is something that we need to bring back, and we've forgotten that in the long run. 30 years ago, a software engineer was seen as the golden boy. It was almost like a golden visa for success. Today, if you're a software engineer, you look down upon that person as if you didn't get any other job elsewhere. I think it's also a mix of how we bring back our academic rigor. We have lost that plot when it comes to the entire thing. The average salary in IT entry jobs have not changed for the last 15 years, which also means adjusted to inflation, these are probably one of the lowest paying jobs because you didn't get anything else. So that's not what we actually intend or want our industry to aspire to be. So how do we bring that dignity back to the entire conversation, which means it also goes back to the root cause, our education system. I mean, what are we teaching in software engineering programs or in our engineering programs is still very, very outdated. And here, of course, the industry needs to also step in. With now the NEP that was launched in 2020, while the implementation will happen, how many actually of the industrial folks get back to college saying, now that professor of practice is allowed by law, how many of the senior folks actually go back to college and say, I will teach? Very few. I mean, everybody sings. It's almost like the IPL, right? I miss the ball, I show the finger to the next guy shows. So the CEO shows it to the CXO, to the HOD, to the HR, to the outsourced L&D teams. I think we need to change the game, saying
the buck needs to stop with someone.
Start with somebody.
Start with somebody, absolutely. And so, before we move forward to the big next news maker, I think essentially what we are arriving at is that this generation of people, they do not want to be bound to a desk and bound to fixed working hours, especially after COVID. The scenarios have changed dramatically for a lot of young people, and they now have an opportunity to be outside the confines of a physical space and fixed time limit or working hours. In this context and in this scenario, is it now important and prudent for perhaps corporate leaders such as Narayana Murthy, who are veterans, to also bring about some shift? A generational shift is perhaps needed in the mindsets around what is productivity, what should be counted as productivity?
Yes and no, but that's where I'll be very interested again from a governance lens. It'll be interesting to hear the head of that organization, Mr. Parekh, to actually speak about what he has in mind for the younger generation. Because end of the day today, Mr. Narayana Murthy, the standing that he has is of his reputation and stature, but he doesn't speak for Infosys. Let's not confuse the two.
Absolutely.
So if it is the IT majors, whether it's Infosys and Wipro, we need those leaders to actually spell out what they have in mind. And the reality is, what do we expect from those youngsters?
Right.
I mean, how do we design their KPI, which means that if you have a clear KPI, do they really need to be in office? Can they work from the bus? I mean, I remember a couple of years ago when Bangalore had huge traffic jams, it still does, but they were even thinking of starting the attendance right from the time somebody boarded the bus and you logged in their laptop. So things like these, I mean, if you can be innovative there, you can also be innovative of how do you judge what is performance.
Absolutely. How do you judge what is performance? And Krishna, perhaps time for Mr. Narayana Murthy and the likes and the ilks of veteran corporate leaders to perhaps go back to the drawing board and understand what is performance versus what is redundant, unproductive, long working hours sitting in an office.
Right, and exactly, and I think another point that gets missed in the entire discussion of hours is that if you want more, you got to put in more. Right. I mean, so I think that. And no generation can ever forego. Your Gen Z, Gen Z plus, from Gen X and the golden generation onwards. You want to become Narayana Murthy, you're not going to get it with a 7-hour shift and then counting every hour and comp offs and this and that. You want to be Narayana Murthy, you got to be willing to put in extra.
Narayana Murthy if you want to be Narayana
So we have multiple C's, right? We have chai, we have cricket, we have cinema, we have conversations. I mean, where do you work? I mean, even in the office, the normal office, you step out, you're going to have a cup of tea every 1 hour, that's 10 minutes gone, corridor conversations and whispers. So I think he's right from that perspective of productivity, especially when you compare the Western nations. When they work those 8 hours, they truly work. They don't take personal calls. But here we are okay with our banker stepping in with a
I have
FD
a feeling
form.
with this discussion, if only the quality of those 8 hours is improved, the entire discussion of a number of hours will go away.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. But I think we'll have to rest it at that.
Yeah.
Narayana Murthy continuing to bat for 60, 70, 80, 90 hours a week. It doesn't stop for him. But if you've got to be Narayana Murthy, you've got to work hard.